When superbosses first appeared in a Final Fantasy game over 30 years ago, they raised the stakes for players in a way that was unlike anything that had ever been experienced before. There had been pseudo-superbosses hidden within random encounters, but it wasn't until the arrival of Omega and Shinryu that they became a purposeful part of the bestiary. Since then, the notion of superbosses has gone through significant evolution, and as player expectations were raised, developers altered superbosses to try and match those expectations. In the previous 4 episodes of this series, we have investigated over 80 different superbosses associated with Final Fantasy, exploring how the implementation changed and evolved across almost 2 decades. So if you're coming in fresh, we'd recommend checking those episodes out via the links in the description below. Also, this will be the final part. We're looking to embark on another mammoth evolutionary study soon, but what we work on will be decided by Patreon supporters. There will likely be a few options, including ultimate weapons, battle systems, and antagonists, so if you'd like to help the channel grow and influence our next topic, please consider supporting us. We will also be publishing an audio-only version of the entire Superboss evolution exclusively on Patreon, so if that's your jam, we've got you covered. But with that in mind, let's continue to explore the complete evolution of superbosses. After its revival as Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, the development team sought to engage players with consistent updates. These updates were designed to both enhance and enrich the story, but also challenge players in new and innovative ways. One such example was the Behemoth level 50 fate, but raids such as the Binding Coil of Bahamut were where the real challenge could be found. As A Realm Reborn progressed, patch 2.1 and 2.2 furthered this notion by introducing extreme versions of trials, akin to what was seen before the launch of A Realm Reborn, and it brought forth the next iteration of the Coil of Bahamut, dubbed the Second Coil of Bahamut. This served as another challenging raid, with Nael Darnus, the final boss of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, returning as a tough encounter. And this mirrored some other games, such as Dissidia, where the final boss was also transformed into a separate superboss. But it was patch 2.3 where things took a much darker turn, as the second Coil of Bahamut Savage was released. Nael Darnus again served as the final boss of this raid, but the challenge was now elevated in a few different ways. For one, positioning was very important now, as a barrier surrounded the battlefield, and should any player touch this, they would suffer an instant KO. This was quite an intriguing addition, as instant KO had been a hallmark trait of superbosses for years, but it was often delivered via specific moves. Here, it was part of the overall makeup of the encounter. Beyond this, Nael Darnus also had the same 13-minute enrage timer as Twintania, and the regular version of Nael from patch 2.2, and there were multiple phases based on health which determined actions taken. The coup de grace of A Realm Reborn was then Bahamut Prime, who was fought at the conclusion of the final Coil of Bahamut. This raid was added as part of patch 2.4, but outside of introducing new abilities that players needed to be mindful of, the general setup was much the same as the previous raids, with a set enrage timer and ability sets that changed according to health milestones. It was perhaps for this reason that the world first clear time for the final Coil of Bahamut was much quicker than the raids added in previous patches. Patch 2.5 then added another superboss contender, Odin. Perhaps as a way of paying tribute to Final Fantasy XI, where Odin was introduced as a tough superboss as part of the Treasures of Artugan expansion, Odin returned as a very challenging level 50 fate. What made this particular fate quite special was the size and scale of the encounter, but beyond that, there were a few intriguing aspects. For one, when the fate was active, a unique weather called tension affected the wider area. Odin could also use a few debuffs, but perhaps the most prominent aspect was that when Odin's health dropped low enough, he started to charge Zantetsuken, and much like in Final Fantasy XI, if Odin was not defeated before the charge time ended, anyone participating in the fate would be instantly killed. After the release of patch 2.5, the Final Fantasy XIV development team continued to release new content for the game, including the Gold Saucer, but eyes were also on the game's first major expansion, dubbed Heavensward. Players were excited to explore the new areas made available and see how the new jobs handled, but they were, of course, also excited to see if they could overcome the new challenges Heavensward would offer. Thankfully, they wouldn't have to wait long, as just over a month after launch, patch 3.05 introduced the Alexander Gordius Savage raid series. Similar to the Bahamut raids, there were numerous turns that needed to be completed, and upon making their way to the final part, they faced off against the Manipulator. The fight itself had a hard enrage and featured numerous phases, and this was similar to Twintania, Nael Deus Darnus, and Bahamut Prime. But the difference here was with how the phases changed. Instead of them being based on specific health reduction levels, players were required to defeat the Manipulator's appendages first, and this was quite unique. It was not uncommon for superbosses to have multiple appendages. This had been a thing ever since Ruby Weapon. However, they had seldom been mandatory to defeat in order to obtain victory, with perhaps the only grey area here being Longui in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. The major difference here was therefore that not only was defeating the appendages mandatory, but players actually had choice over which appendage they defeated first. The other unique aspect was that once a leg was defeated, players then had a small window where they could attack the Manipulator, before then having to defeat one of the other remaining appendages. And this would also bring about a new phase in the boss fight, a cycle that continued until all appendages were defeated. After numerous forays into the mobile gaming space, Square Enix started to find their feet with an array of releases that included Mobius and Brave Exvius. But before both of those games, Square Enix released another title called Record Keeper. Alongside the story, players were kept busy with numerous collection events that challenged players in different ways and offered some fun rewards. In early June of 2015, this notion was enhanced via bonus battles, which started with the Plus difficulty. A month later, Plus difficulty was introduced, but the real spike came with the introduction of Plus battles towards the end of the year. The first Plus bonus battle was centered around Final Fantasy IV, with Dark Bahamut appearing as the final boss of that particular bonus run. But it was the bonus battle that came just after, called Ultimate Guardian, that pushed players to the limit. Players were tasked with defeating stages of increasing difficulty, with the final stage seeing them square off against the Sanctuary Keeper. And what made the challenge so extreme was the capacity for bosses like the Sanctuary Keeper to just tear through the entire party in one turn. At launch, it meant the content was quite brutal, and it took players some time to figure out how to compensate for the harsh tactics employed by the final stage of these plus bonus battles. As Final Fantasy XI entered into its twilight years, the developers wanted to go out with a bang. Rhapsodies of Vana'diel was planned to be the final major storyline update, and it saw new chapters released throughout 2015. However, the developers were not done with the game after these updates were released. They wanted to continue to keep players engaged. They just planned to do this via content updates as opposed to scenario updates. In May 2016, this saw the arrival of the Master Trials. Building upon the notion of the high-tier mission battles, Master Trials were purpose-designed encounters that were created to appeal to players who had just about completed all other aspects of the game and were looking for something else to tackle. It meant that the Master Trials were intended to cater to a select bunch of players, and the rewards reflected this, as they offered custom in-battle cosmetics to the victors. As the game then continued to receive updates, the Master Trials ended up becoming a focal point, and they remained ready and waiting for new challenges. While Final Fantasy XI was building out its Master Trials, Final Fantasy XIV was continuing to pump out content relating to Heavensward. And as the expansion reached its conclusion, so too did its Alexander-centric raid series. Much like A Realm Reborn had the final Coil of Bahamut, this saw the third and final Alexander raid series released as part of patch 3.4. It was called Alexander the Creator Savage, with the final raid instance being called the Soul of the Creator. And waiting for players at the end of this punishing raid was none other than Alexander Prime. However, it wasn't just Alexander. Although players would square off against the legendary summon at the beginning of the encounter, once the first phase had been concluded, Alexander disappeared, replaced by lesser minions. By this point in the franchise, it had become quite common for superbosses to call upon enemies to support them in combat, with Rhapsodiel even absorbing them to gain some health back. But they had never appeared in place of a superboss before, as, well, the superboss was meant to be the main event. During the third phase, Alexander Prime regained that main event status, as it sprouted wings and caused continual pain for parties. This came via debuffs that felt relentless due to their large AoE circles, but also the tethering mechanics at play. Perhaps the most unique aspect of the encounter, though, came during Phase 4, thanks to the Time Gate mechanic. Alexander Prime summoned 4 support minions, which then entered a Time Gate. Players were then required to defeat these minions before Divine Judgment could be cast, but the unique aspect here was that players had to actually enter the Time Gates, which took them to a separate instance, and nothing like this had ever been seen before. World of Final Fantasy, in many ways, was a breath of fresh air for the franchise. It fought against the relentless push for action-orientated gameplay and brought back the traditional active time battle system, enhancing it via the stacking mechanic. There was also a very cutesy art style, and on the surface, this made World of Final Fantasy seem like a game that was geared less towards the hardcore. But as the narrative developed, the story became more mature, and the gameplay became much more challenging. This notion then manifested in the most extreme sense via a superboss that was simply called XG. XG could be found within the EX Dungeon Z, one of the game's bonus dungeons. This was pretty standard, but there was something about XG that was very much the opposite of being standard, and that related to the superboss's etymology. Every prior superboss had been a unique creation or a reference of some kind to a previous entity known within the Final Fantasy universe. But here, the superboss was a reference to another IP owned by Square Enix, Xenogears. The other unique aspect relating to XG was that after the fight concluded, due to the wider gameplay mechanics, the reward for winning the encounter was that XG joined the team as a mirage. And this then meant that players could use the superboss to enhance their own party. Now, even though Record Keeper came first, Brave Exvius took mobile gaming by storm, at least when looking at it from a Final Fantasy perspective. There had been numerous games released before Brave Exvius, but none were as rich and detailed, and it led to the game receiving a huge following that dwarfed the other equivalent properties being produced by Square Enix. Part of this was due to the fundamentals driving the game. Brave Exvius was based on an already established game called Brave Frontier, which was produced by Alim. Square Enix then worked with Alim to produce a Final Fantasy equivalent, but it was heavily modified to appeal to that specific audience. And this meant alongside the story, it featured solid gameplay options and of course, plenty of challenges to keep players engaged. For a while, this challenge felt quite reasonable and within the bounds of the game. But there always comes a point where the challenge increases at an uncomfortable pace, and in Brave Exvius, one of the most notable instances of this came with the launch of an event called Trials of the Creator. What made the encounter so tough was the sheer damage output from Maxwell, the superboss in question. At this point in Brave Exvius' life cycle, there weren't too many characters who could serve as breakers, but without one, Maxwell was nigh impossible to defeat. The other curious element at play here was that Maxwell was also not a character original to either Brave Exvius or Final Fantasy in general. Similar to XG, Maxwell was related to another IP, and in this case, it was Brave Frontier, the game that inspired Brave Exvius. Final Fantasy XV arrived towards the end of 2016 after a rather tumultuous development cycle that had lasted over a decade. Due to its origins as Final Fantasy Versus 13, its structure and gameplay style had quite a few differences in comparison to previous mainline entries, but that didn't mean the developers skimped in areas fans expected, and this meant there were numerous superbosses created as a way of testing players. Perhaps the most notorious in this regard has to be the Adamantoise. Reappearing as a superboss, this iteration of the Adamantoise referenced a few different prior superbosses. The most obvious has to be Longui in Final Fantasy XIII, as the Adamantoise was huge and could therefore be found on the world map. But the other notable reference here was Yzmat due to the intense size of Adamantoise's HP pool. At launch, this meant players could end up spending hours upon hours attempting to defeat the Adamantoise, and it was even joked about pre-launch that it could take days, something that evoked uncomfortable memories of Pandemonium Warden. Perhaps due to the severity of the encounter, the Adamantoise was then adjusted just after 6 months after the launch of Final Fantasy XV. This came via patch 1.06, although it was an inadvertent patch, as instead of nerfing the Adamantoise, the patch introduced a significant weakness that allowed players to defeat it in just one move. And this was because the patch removed enemy immunities to Alterna, a move available through the Ring of the Lucii. It would still take quite a few tries thanks to random number generation, but this meant the Adamantoise could be defeated in mere minutes as opposed to hours, with the player barely needing to lift a finger. The other two superbosses featured in Final Fantasy XV also harkened back to superbosses of old. Naglfar, for example, was fought at the end of an extensive line of side quests that were akin to the hunt system in Final Fantasy XII and XIII. MAX Angelus Zero then referenced Warmech and the Iron Giant, the old superbosses from the earlier Final Fantasy games. And this was because, unlike almost every other superboss era featured throughout the illustrious history of the franchise, MAX Angelus Zero was a random encounter dropped from airships during Chapter 15 on unsuspecting and unfortunate foes. One of the other interesting aspects around this superboss related to its damage limitation capabilities, as even the colossal astrals were unable to deal high damage figures. Now in the background, while games like World of Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy XV kept players occupied with standalone offline experiences, Record Keeper was continuing to challenge its player base at an increasing pace. Almost as soon as the +++ difficulty bonus battles were introduced, they were surpassed by ultimate difficulty. But compared to the previous jump, it was much more manageable and expected. The next major jump therefore came in May of 2017 following the arrival of Apocalypse difficulty bonus battles, with the entry point being another Final Fantasy X themed event called Dreaming's End. What made this specific event stand out was that it harkened back to some previous superbosses that were faced as a gauntlet, and for this battle, players had to fight against Valefor, Ifrit, and Ixion back to back, with Ixion being by far the hardest due to his ultimate Aerospark ability. Not to be left out with the ongoing power creep within Square Enix's persistent mobile games, Brave Exvius went through something of a punishing event gauntlet itself. A month after Record Keeper had its Dreaming's End event, Brave Exvius went live with Attack of the Gilgamesh, and this saw the notorious antagonist return yet again. Similar to previous instances of Gilgamesh appearing as a superboss, the fight was brutal, and one of the main reasons was the ability called Bushido Freedom. Not only did this ability inflict an instant KO on one party member, it also did 5 times hybrid damage to all surviving party members, and removed all of their positive status effects. Gilgamesh also had 1 million HP, which was quite hefty at the time. However, even though the encounter was tough, it paled in comparison to Rumble of the Malboro. This saw everyone's favourite enemy, the Great Malboro, appearing as a punishing superboss that had 10 million HP. But what made the fight hard wasn't so much the Great Malboro and its high HP pool, it was the requirement for the players to fight off all of the regular Malboro at the same time, as they each had 4 million HP and had plenty of their own horrible abilities to punish the party with. After the incredible story arc of Heavensward, Final Fantasy XIV had started to gain some real momentum, and after the announcement of the game's second expansion, Stormblood, fans were expectant. They wanted to see how the developers could up the ante even further. From the perspective of superbosses, there were some tough challenges towards the start, with some S-rank elite marts and some punishing fates, including the likes of Ixion. There were also some new trials added, and a new Savage Raid series. But much of this was par for the course in terms of what had already been seen from Final Fantasy XIV up until this point. The developers, however, were just teasing players, and the true test of Stormblood was unveiled as part of patch 4.11, following the appearance of the first ultimate raid called the Unending Coil of Bahamut. Unlike the previous challenging raids, the Unending Call of Bahamut only consisted of a single encounter, and that encounter pitted players against 3 previous Final Fantasy XIV superbosses in a sequential encounter. Yes, players needed to beat Twintania, Nael Deus Darnus, and Bahamut Prime back to back, and they then needed to fight Twintania and Nael at the same time. This was a pretty significant evolution on the previous concept of sequential superboss encounters. But that wasn't the end, as after the defeat of Twintania and Nael, Golden Bahamut Prime appeared as the true superboss. Further to this, prior to the appearance of Golden Bahamut, the party had a forced wipe due to the power of Terror Flare. The party would then be brought back by Phoenix and given Phoenix Blessing, as well as a full limit break gauge. But if Bahamut was not brought down to 60% health before the Twintania and Nael phase started, Golden Bahamut was given a significant damage buff that would make the encounter almost impossible to win. Should Golden Bahamut also not be defeated before it completed 5 sequences of its ability set, it became enraged, also making the encounter nearly impossible to win. Even though Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 was positioned as a follow-up to the original game, significant changes were made to almost every single aspect, and alongside the narrative and gameplay systems, this also related to superbosses. In Dimensions, 3 superbosses could be found within a bonus location called the Gladiator's Hall. Dimensions 2 altered this by having its most powerful superbosses appear within the Babel Tower. In the initial free-to-play version of Dimensions 2, there was a training location that could be accessed every day. There were limits placed on how often the stages could be tackled to work in with the typical mechanics of supply and demand in mobile games. Alongside the easier training stages was the Babel Tower, and this worked in much the same way, albeit with tougher enemies and better rewards. As time passed, more and more levels were added to the Babel Tower, and they featured increasingly tougher enemies. When Dimensions 2 was then transitioned from a free-to-play game to a standalone game, the Babel Tower was retained. New floors were now unlocked as progress was made throughout the main game, but the hardest floors were reserved as post-game content. Similar to Trial Mode from Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac job system, the challenge kept getting harder and harder. But the major difference here was that almost every encounter faced on a post-game floor could be considered a superboss. Floor 36, for example, contained a fight against Omega, with there also being encounters against Chaos and Ultimate Weapon. The final floor then saw players square off against Proto-Babil, the superboss from both the Final Fantasy IV Remake and Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light, which were of course 2 games that the team had previously worked on. And similar to what was seen in the past, Proto-Babil ended up being a multi-phase encounter where its different body parts needed to be defeated. Perhaps one of the most unique aspects around Dimensions 2 though, was that many of the superbosses required specific members of the party to be present, and this represented a fun twist on Type 0, where Gilgamesh selected a specific party member to square off against. After the release of Final Fantasy XV, the development team got straight back to work on delivering their ambitious rollout for downloadable content. There were 3 story-driven episodes that were used to help fill in some of the noticeable gaps in the story, but perhaps the most intriguing expansion was Comrades. Whereas the rest of the game was focused on single-player, party-based combat, Comrades turned Final Fantasy XV into a multiplayer experience where you could create a member of the Kingsglaive and fight alongside other members of your ilk who were controlled by real people from around the world. Given the adjusted nature of the experience and its ever-evolving nature, the developers wanted to make sure there were plenty of challenges for people to tackle. And to keep things consistent, MAX Angelus Zero returned as a challenging superboss. Encounterable as a training mission in the Nordoskine garrison, what made this particular fight challenging ended up being a throwback to Type 0, as MAX Angelus Zero had to be fought one-on-one, just like true Gilgamesh. Not long after the launch of the Comrades multiplayer expansion, Square Enix then launched Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition and Windows Edition. Part of the appeal was that this new version came with all the paid and free downloadable content packed in, but there were also a few surprises thrown in to tempt back those who had already bought the game before. And one of those surprises came in the form of a brand new superboss called Omega. The general appearance was congruent with what might be expected from Omega. But additional lore was added that aligned Omega with the ancient civilization of Solheim, and this represented a nice twist. Its defeat also granted the Omega badge as a way of cementing the reference. Alongside this, Omega was then added as a superboss in Comrades. As one Final Fantasy multiplayer experience continued to develop and expand, so too did another. After the release of the unending coil of Bahamut, the Final Fantasy XIV player base were curious to see where the developers would take Stormblood next. Patch 4.2 brought a brand new Savage raid, and patch 4.31 brought a new Ultimate raid called the Weapons Refrain. But while both of these posed significant challenges, albeit for different reasons, the next major superboss came alongside the release of patch 4.4. AlphaScape version 4.0 Savage served as the conclusion of the AlphaScape raid series, and in this regard it was similar to the previous high-tier raids. As such, this was where the most challenging encounter was housed, and it saw players square off against Omega M and Omega F. On the surface, this was similar to the unending coil of Bahamut and the Four Heroes of Light, as it meant multiple superbosses were encountered at the same time. Compared to those previous instances though, there was a significant hike up in challenge, with countless abilities, patterns and weaknesses that needed to be memorized and adapted to. There was also an evolution of the concept, as after defeating Omega M and Omega F, the final form of Omega surfaced. And this represented the only instance thus far of two superbosses merging into a single, more powerful superboss as part of the same fight. What also made the encounter complex was the sheer volume of potential abilities, evolutions of existing abilities, and how those abilities combined. Cascading Latent Defect, for example, could even end in a complete wipe should it not be handled in the correct manner. Now, a few years after the release of World of Final Fantasy, the developers sought to bring the game to new audiences. The original version was released on PlayStation devices exclusively, with a Windows version launching the following year. But towards the end of 2018, World of Final Fantasy was re-released on the Switch and Xbox One as World of Final Fantasy Maxima, with the Maxima portion also being made available as downloadable content for the existing version except the Vita, as it was too large. On that basis, Maxima added a boatload of content, including Nightmare difficulty, a new secret ending, and of course, a handful of new superbosses. And perhaps the most intriguing was Enna. Enna had been a powerful ally throughout the main scenario, serving as one of the primary motivators for Ren and Lan. She was also a god, something that was doubled down on via her in-game character description, but she tried her hardest not to get involved in a direct capacity, choosing to assist the party in more subtle ways. It was therefore quite surprising that Enna not only appeared as a superboss after clearing the postscript, but that she was assisted by Tama and Seraphi. And alongside this fulfilling the trait of a superboss being supported by minions, there were some other interesting nuances. For one, once Enna was defeated, she would be revived back to full health by Tama's Time Walk ability. And this served as a clear parallel to the Kaiser Dragon from Final Fantasy VI Advance. In that instance, once the Kaiser Dragon had been defeated or enough time had passed, it would use Barrier Change to reset its HP back up to maximum and bringing about a new attack phase. Here, Tama would continue to revive Enna until Time Walk had been used 8 times. Only then could the superboss be defeated. The other interesting note, however, was that Time Walk wasn't exclusively associated with Enna. Tama could use the ability if any of the enemy combatants were defeated, including itself. Seraphi also reintroduced the notion of a superboss adapting to the player. By using Rumor Radar, Seraphi alerted Enna to whatever elemental weakness the current party setup had, and once locked in, Enna would follow up with the appropriate elemental spell to exploit that weakness. The next superboss could only be fought after defeating XG, the superboss from the main game, as this was the prerequisite to unlocking the hidden dungeon. Inside, players could find Garland. But similar to the fight against Enna, Garland was not alone, as he was accompanied in the fight by the 4 Fiends. This fight also featured an adaptive nature, as Garland adjusted his moveset and elemental weaknesses based on how many of the 4 Fiends remained, and which ones had been defeated so far. For example, should the player defeat Lich, Then Garland would gain a -100 elemental weakness to the Earth element and gain access to the Earthquake ability. The other interesting element around Garland versus Enna Crow was that Garland, similar to XG, could then be used as an ally upon defeat. Another superboss, called the Immortal Dark Dragon, could be squared off against by solving a puzzle. After navigating inside a new portal that appeared within the Crystal Tower, players were tasked with activating 6 elemental switches around the world. After doing so, and re-entering the portal, players found the Immortal Dark Dragon waiting for them. The Immortal Dark Dragon had a considerable pool of HP and could use Dark Summon Replica to bring forth numerous copies of itself, each of which acted independently. But perhaps the most curious aspect was that upon being defeated, the Immortal Dark Dragon had one final trick: Dragon Dive. This powerful ability had the potential to catch unprepared players by surprise due to the damage dealing potential, and it could also serve as a bitter pill for those who thought they'd won, only to be defeated by its final attack. Upon the defeat of Enna Crow, Garland, and the Immortal Dark Dragon, a final superboss then unlocked. And this fulfilled a trait now seen numerous times, as the final superboss was Exnine Bahamut, the game's main antagonist. However, this time Exnine Bahamut had 2 forms and was much stronger, with new abilities and different elemental weaknesses. Defeating this souped-up version of Exnine Bahamut then granted a type of new reward, as it unlocked a new post-credits scene. The other aspect worth mentioning here was that, like a few other superbosses such as Minerva in Crisis Core and those that featured in Lightning Returns, the superbosses in Maxima could be made even harder if tackled on Nightmare difficulty, which was only available via New Game Plus. By the release of World of Final Fantasy Maxima, games like Record Keeper and Brave Exvius were well into their operational runs. And as players continued to spend money and pour more and more time into each game, the developers had to keep bringing forth new challenges to keep them occupied. In Record Keeper, it saw the arrival of Armageddon difficulty bonus battles throughout 2018. But the next major hike up in difficulty came via the Magicite dungeons, which could only be unlocked after completing the Nightmare dungeons. And Brave Exvius continued its theme of having challenging encounters come via collaborations, with Marchenko from Deus Ex and the Dragon Lord from Dragon Quest serving as 2 prominent examples. Final Fantasy XIV also continued to expand, with Shadowbringers arriving as the 3rd expansion during the middle of 2019. But even though numerous challenges were introduced at launch, such as Forbidden Rebellion as a new elite mark, the first significant test came via the Epic of Alexander, which was introduced alongside patch 5.11. Much like the previous Ultimate Raids, the Epic of Alexander tasked players with defeating a deluge of tough enemies back to back as part of a continuous encounter. First, they had to tackle Living Liquid, then Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser before Alexander Prime returned. During this 3rd phase, similar to Weapons Refrain and Alphascape, numerous puzzle components were introduced to try and make the encounter far more challenging. And after navigating this, the true superboss emerged, Perfect Alexander. Alongside the devilish abilities, each with their own unique puzzles, Alexander, similar to the Immortal Dark Dragon in World of Final Fantasy Maxima, called forth numerous clones, and this further complicated the encounter. With so many foes, overlapping abilities and on-screen cues, keeping track of everything going on proved to be quite challenging. And to clear the raid and figure out all the nuances involved, players ended up using third-party tools to edit waymarks. This was not punished at the time, but Square Enix did remove this ability upon the launch of patch 5.2. After many years of waiting and expectation building, the Final Fantasy VII Remake released in April of 2020. But one of the questions that needed answering amongst hardcore enthusiasts was, how could the game incorporate superbosses? The original game featured some now legendary superbosses in Ruby and Emerald Weapon, but they only appeared much later in the original game. With the Final Fantasy VII Remake only tackling Midgar, it was impossible for them to feature, so the development team had to come up with something original. Packed within the game were numerous challenges that presented themselves via Chadley's VR missions, Don Corneo's Colosseum, and the Shinra Combat Simulator missions. But to gain access to the final VR simulator mission, dubbed 3-Person Team vs Top Secrets, players had to finish every challenge in the Colosseum and the Combat Simulator. The other caveat was that this mission only became available during New Game Plus, specifically when playing on hard difficulty. Even though multi-stage encounters were now quite common within the MMO space, they weren't anywhere near as prevalent within the offline entries. The 3-person team versus Top Secret tasked players with overcoming 4 separate stages before being able to even face off against the new superboss called Pride and Joy. However, in a weird twist, Pride and Joy was not the most challenging aspect of the mission, as in the round before, players were tasked with defeating Bahamut and Ifrit at the same time, which was far more difficult. Pride and Joy also had significant weaknesses, as it was vulnerable to lightning damage, and it only had a few abilities that were well telegraphed and quite easy to avoid. This meant Pride and Joy served as the first real instance of an anticlimactic superboss, as although it was challenging as a single enemy, it served more as a reprieve than a further heightening of the overall experience. It was perhaps for this reason that a brand new superboss was introduced via Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, the enhanced version of the game that was released on the PlayStation 5. The unlock method was quite similar here, as supplemental content had to be completed. However, the difference this time around was that the content was part of Episode Intermission, the downloadable content, as opposed to the main game, which was where the superboss had to be fought. Only after Yuffie's episode was complete could the player then gain access to a new combat simulator challenge against Vyse the Immaculate. Unlike Pride and Joy, Vyse had no obvious weakness, and even had heavy resistance to physical and magical damage. This meant the only way of hurting Vyse was to inflict a stagger, but even this posed a challenge, as Vyse had a move called Rejuvenation, which reduced his stagger gauge over time. Vyse also used brutal abilities such as Immaculate End, which dealt maximum damage to all party members, bringing about an immediate game over should some kind of re-raise not be in effect. In short, Vyse more than made up for Pride and Joy's lackluster showing. He did, however, have a weakness: Tifa. Due to Tifa's ability to increase stagger at an incredible rate, and to increase stagger damage, she could be employed to wreck Vyse in a very small amount of time. And when combined with the damage dealing capabilities of other party members, it's even possible to defeat Vyse in less than 30 seconds. After the relaunch of Final Fantasy XIV as A Realm Reborn, the development team had managed to keep a pretty consistent release schedule for expansions. It saw Heavensward release 2 years later, and Stormblood and Shadowbringers release with a similar cadence. The plan was, no doubt, for Endwalker to follow the same trend, but production suffered numerous delays due to an unexpected global event. This meant Endwalker launched towards the end of 2021, and its initial content and immediate patches followed a similar trend. This meant some challenging fates were added, some new hunts came, and in patch 6.05, a new Savage Raid was added. However, the first major test didn't arrive until patch 6.11, and it came via a new ultimate dungeon called Dragon Song's Reprise. The general structure of the raid was similar to previous ultimate raids. This meant it was a multi-stage encounter that increased in difficulty upon the completion of each phase. However, unlike the previous ultimate raids, which had 4 or 5 clear phases, Dragon Song's Reprise had 7. And to up the ante even further, there was now an intermission. After defeating Phase 4, players saw time rewind, and they ended up back at Phase 1, or at least that's how it seemed at first glance. Superbosses had numerous forms before depending on how the fight was initiated, and of course, many had featured numerous forms during the fight itself, but there had never been a scenario where the fight had reset. However, as alluded to, it wasn't quite the same. There was now something different: Haurchefant. Unlike Phase 1, you would need to manage the encounter and everything related to it while keeping Haurchefant alive. Should Haurchefant fall, the player still moved on to Phase 2, which was now actually Phase 5, but a wipe was inevitable as the fight became unwinnable, another first for a superboss, at least in this manner. If Haurchefant survived, however, then the second half of the raid series changed, becoming even more complicated and challenging than the first half, and this culminated in a confrontation against Dragon King Thordan. Compared to many of the recent Ultimate raids, and indeed the various phases of this one, Dragon King Thordan was mechanically quite similar and more akin to a traditional superboss from the wider franchise. But that didn't mean the challenge was diminished, and Thordan could deal some serious damage. In the months that followed Dragonsong's reprise, players were challenged with another Savage raid, but this was eclipsed by another Ultimate raid that was released alongside patch 0.31 called the Omega Protocol. In the build-up, Yoshida had noted that Dragonsong's reprise was the hardest Ultimate raid found in the game, and that the Omega Protocol was not intended to be any harder. But upon release, players found a serious hike up in terms of challenge. Similar to Dragonsong's reprise, the Omega Protocol served as a reimagining of a previous encounter, as the first two phases saw players square off again against Omega, then Omega M, and Omega F. Omega then attempted to reconfigure itself just like in the Alphascape Savage. But now, the encounter took a new path, as the Omega that emerged was different. From this point forward, the challenge ramped up even further, with some devilish phases, including one against Omega M, Omega F, Omega, and Omega Reconfigured, which culminated in a potential wipe should enough damage not be dealt. This then served as a precursor to the final phase against Alpha Omega. Due to all the potential variants at play throughout the entire raid, the Omega Protocol ended up being quite brutal for players, and it led to a lot of controversy. The first clear was only achieved through the use of third-party tools, and unlike the Epic of Alexander, this time there was significant backlash. It led to Yoshida even commenting. He confirmed that there was indeed an illicit use of third-party tools, and that the individuals identified would be punished. After the arrival of Vice in Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, fans were left curious as to who would appear as the superboss in the next installment of the trilogy, if indeed there would even be one within the base game. It turned out that Rebirth did indeed feature a superboss, but it manifested in a way that was quite different to many previous superbosses, except those that featured in Lightning Returns. Gilgamesh ended up being encountered numerous times throughout the game, as he was a prominent part of the Proto-Relic side quest. This then culminated with a trip to an isolated island in the Meridian Sea, where 4 challenging encounters needed to be overcome, and once accomplished, Gilgamesh could then be faced. The encounter itself had numerous quirks based around the stagger mechanic, and when reaching low health, Gilgamesh did a countdown move that could easily end in a swift game over. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect was that similar to the superbosses in Lightning Returns, Gilgamesh could be fought on different difficulties, and this could have a dramatic impact on the challenge he posed. Final Fantasy XVI had the potential to be a very challenging game, but due to the way the gameplay mechanics were handled, there was nothing akin to a superboss within the base game. Svarog was perhaps the toughest challenge amongst the hunts, but the level was not raised any further after this point, and subsequent hunts did not raise expectations on the player. This notion remained much the same until the launch of Echoes of the Fallen, the game's first piece of downloadable content, and it wasn't until the Rising Tide that there was an encounter that ticked the superboss traits via the Shadow Within. Referencing back to some previous superbosses such as the Judge Magisters in Final Fantasy XII, the Shadow Within was hidden in a new endgame mode called the Kairos Gate, and it could only be fought against should the player complete every Kairos Gate stage on Final Fantasy difficulty with an S rating. This was no easy task. The Shadow Within then resurfaced another trait of a boss re-emerging as a much tougher superboss. In this case, the Shadow Within was an intense version of the Infernal Shadow. The unique angle here, however, was that due to the Kairos Gate being part of the Areta Stone, there was a leaderboard, and this meant players could see how they fared against other people who had attempted to beat the Shadow Within and succeeded. This leaderboard could also be used to highlight internal scores that were accomplished by using the Rings of Accessibility, an alternative to specific difficulty settings. That the superboss found deep within Final Fantasy XVI's downloadable content resurfaced these traits highlighted how far superbosses had come since their inclusion way back in the earliest Final Fantasy games. Whereas many of the original superbosses could be found wandering dungeons or indeed the world map, waiting to snare players in an unsuspecting and cruel trap, as the mechanics evolved, they became a purposeful way for the most hardcore players to test themselves. This often facilitated having quite high barriers for entry, and has led to superbosses being hidden away in bonus dungeons or bonus modes. But having now studied well over 100 different superbosses across the entire breadth of the franchise, from mainline entries through to spin-offs, mobile titles and MMOs, it's clear there are common threads that connect them all, even if they may not always be immediately obvious. But with that, my name is Daryl, and this has been the Complete Evolution of Superbosses. Thank you so much for watching, and if you had fun and enjoyed this rather lengthy discussion, please support the channel by liking the video and commenting below to give us your thoughts on the subject as a whole. Any interactions you make really do help us out, but they also help us to understand what you like to see. So if you do genuinely like this kind of content, please let us know. A special thanks also has to be given to our Patreon supporters. Without their support, this channel would not be possible. So every episode is dedicated to them, and especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent, and Sukan TDK, who are super special Unionized supporters. We are incredibly grateful to all of you, and to repeat, without your support, this channel would not be possible. If you would like to support the channel, consider becoming a member of Patreon. For as little as $3 per month, you gain access to perks such as videos early, free from advertising, audio-only versions of our super long-form content like this evolutionary series, and voting rights that help us determine what our next major evolutionary series is going to be. Alright everyone, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.